everyone. Good evening. I apologize for not being able to address you in French. I wish that I could. I hugely enjoyed following these previous talks. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be speaking with you tonight. And thank you very much for having invited me to share a stage and to share what I hope will be a story as strange and as surprising as the two stories that have just been told in this series tonight. So I am going to primarily tell you the history of a subculture, a very small subculture, one that has been almost entirely forgotten, one that even when it existed, consisted only of, at most, a few hundred people who published magazines, subscribed to mailing lists, communicated with one another, and attended meetings and events together, largely in the San Francisco Bay Area and California. The reason why this subculture matters is that almost everyone, aside from, as we have just learned, Satoshi Nakamoto, him or her or themselves, almost everyone we can definitively connect to the creation of Bitcoin was a part of this subculture, was a part of this movement. And the movement was called extropianism. Within its ranks, it counted the person who was running the cryptography list on which the first Bitcoin white paper was posted. We count many of the people whose photographs you saw in the previous talk when it was going through the possible candidates. Almost all of them were extropians in one way or another. And so what I would love to do tonight is to both explain the nature of extropianism to you, and through that, to talk about the transhumanist heritage that is built into the underlying technologies behind Bitcoin and blockchain systems, the strange luggage of visionary, utopian, post-human transformation, which was embedded in the goals and the hopes for the system which we now see, playing out in practice in such awkward, real ways in the world. And I would like to unpack some of that history with you. So first of all, extropianism itself was a newly coined term by a philosopher, and I'm not quite sure how to describe the other person, a philosopher and a philosopher's friend, both of whom renamed themselves. Renaming oneself was a major aspect of extropian practice. So Max O'Connor became Max Moore, and Tom Bell became T.O. Morrow, tomorrow. They loved these sort of pun names that would capture a spirit of unlimited futurity. And between the two of them, and because I can't show slides, I'm actually going to tell you a story through physical archives, of all things. Between the two of them, they launched a project, Extropy. Extropy begins as a magazine. As you can see, a vaccine for future shock. Begins as a magazine which seeks to set out a series of philosophical commitments that express a militant commitment to transhumanism. And I say militant in the specific sense of no longer just taking transhumanism, which had been kicking around in the circles of futurists and futurologists for the last 20 years or so prior to this publication, but to instead see it not simply as the inevitable future of humans transcending themselves through technology, transcending mortality, transcending the limits of language and cognition, transcending even space and time, but to instead see that as something that had to aggressively be brought about through a program of commitment to spontaneous organization. They had this elaborate system of beliefs, which, as I hope we can see in a way that I think will connect very nicely with Serge's talk earlier today, that connect very deeply with theology in many ways. But spontaneous organization, dynamic optimism, intelligent technology, I can't remember the last two, but they're along the exact same lines. Physical immortality is one of them. A belief that we need to put every technological capacity that we humans have into the service of achieving this transcendent breakthrough in human life. And we need to do so urgently. So their fundamental commitment, from which they draw their name, is to provide the alternative to entropy, right? So if we understand entropy in thermodynamic terms as the gradual loss of usable energy in the universe. We understand entropy as the absence of information in information theory terms. For the extropians, the goal is to have the opposite of the entropic process in the universe, to have an excess, an endless increase in information, in available energy, in longevity, in complexity, to have more space and time for not just every aspect of human life, but also for the proliferation of other kinds of minds and other kinds of life on Earth and throughout the universe. So this may sound somewhat familiar to many of us who have studied utopian history and theory and philosophy. It has echoes of the Russian cosmists, of their extraordinary vision of the long-term goal of technological development being the eventual resurrection of all prior life. We may hear echoes of, and he was indeed a direct influence on them, of Teilhard de Chardin and Le Point Omega, of like the inevitable end of the universe in a total comprehensive state of intelligence. We can hear echoes of these previous metaphysical projects, but the extropians were working in a very specific context, which was not just American, but Californian. So they approached this philosophy in the most Californian possible sense, which was to try to realize these grand metaphysical aims through a combination of technology, extreme forms of market capitalism, and self-improvement. I'm from California, and there's something sort of haunting about reading through the Extropian archive, because I feel like it captures the spirit of the Bay Area in a very uncomfortable way. So through a combination of gleaming smile positivity, artificial intelligence, health supplements, and attitude training, the Extropians would be able to produce the social context that would lead to the breakthroughs that they wanted to see. So this left them, though, with a very peculiar kind of problem, a very peculiar historical trap that they fell into, which was that they were convinced, being optimists and transhumanists, that this future of radical innovation and relentless breakthroughs that would render the whole human condition effectively meaningless, that this future was inevitable, that it would come. In this way, it's a model, a historical model that's very similar to the singularity, which I would be happy to discuss further if anyone would like to. The idea that there are going to be inevitable self-augmenting technological breakthroughs, which will accelerate innovation to such a degree that within a very short period of time, all prior historical constraints will be matters of the past, will be rendered unimportant. However, for the Extropians, the painful part of this belief, this deep conviction that they had, was that these breakthroughs were going to come, but what if they came after the Extropians themselves died? What could be possibly more painful or ironic than to be a member of the last generation before immortality? And in particular, to be a member of the last generation before immortality who were trying actively to bring it about. Like what the level of historical irony there is just hurts. So their solution to this was to try to find mechanisms by which innovation could be radically accelerated. And as a second thread to this, which we will come back to, mechanisms by which, should they have the misfortune to die, they could be brought back into the future of innovation and abundance that they had helped create. And their solution, being, American market-obsessed people, was to do so through money, through the development of new systems of money and new kinds of markets. The proposal begins very, very quickly. The first initial models for this idea start with what they call idea futures. And I'm actually going to, I'm so delighted to be able to break out this archive and show you samples of these things. So this is an early draft of what the libertarian economist Robin Hanson calls an idea coupon. And the doctrine of the idea coupon is that you will actually issue currency against future events. And the more plausible those events become, the more people are invested in those events coming to pass, the more people will commit to trying to make that event take place. And only if it takes place on the date that you have predicted will the notes appreciate in value so that you can actually claim value from it. It's a somewhat more complicated system than that, but the goal is to transform even the cash that people use every day into something that is a direct investment in bringing about this future of visionary transformation. And for the record, this specific idea coupon of Robin's, I still have this, and it's going to appreciate in 2020. And I intend to be possibly the only person on planet Earth who will attempt to claim it from Robin for having not succeeded in coming to pass in the way that he predicted. So they have this vision of idea futures. Perhaps those could work as some kind of currency that could drive the innovation that will make it so that they don't have to die. They also become increasingly fascinated, and this is an area where we start to see real connections with things like the Silk Road. They become increasingly fascinated with the idea that they need to create a proliferation of laissez-faire capitalist operations. Unregulated gray markets and black markets, new kinds of currency, new kinds of banks, which will, in their wild proliferation, according to the economic doctrine that the extropians believe in, inevitably spur this accelerated transformation of society. And in this regard, they, bizarrely enough, build their vision of the future on Friedrich Hayek, on the notable Austrian economist, Nobel Prize winner, and apologist for the Pinochet regime in Chile, Friedrich Hayek, who here appears in a mocked-up extropian note that they plan to issue from their future utopia. The two major extropian figures, Moore and Morrow, actually printed themselves on the back wearing sunglasses and waving to the audience, which is real chutzpah, as we would say in New York. So this vision of what the future could be, they start to turn towards the idea of, well, the only way that we can really bring this about is by instituting as many social systems as we can that can spur the growth of these new forms of experiment and innovation. Because the planning of societies, our willingness to come up with new ideas, to invest in new technologies, these things are too slow for the extropians because they might die before their utopia comes to pass. So they become deeply involved in how to build digital cash. Building some kind of digital cash system that cannot be regulated, that cannot be taxed, that cannot be prevented from being invested in these new schemes, paid into these sort of new radical health regimes that they're beginning to get interested in. All of these mechanisms that could be used to slow the pace of innovation down, digital cash could sidestep all of those. So the Extropian project finally takes shape at this point in the mid-1990s as a project of building anonymous, encrypted, digital cash platforms that will be able to fuel the growth in gray markets and black markets that will in turn, so they believe, be able to spur the development of new experimental technologies, especially in longevity, that will enable them to sort of stretch the gap between their own lifetimes and immortality, and a future of being disembodied minds in satellites in space. So it's within this moment that we start to see all of the different people who come to play a role in Bitcoin coming together, being attracted to this project in different ways. Ralph Merkle, who is the person who develops the Merkle tree, the underlying cryptographic element that makes up a key part of the blockchain, becomes an active member of the Extropian community. Nick Szabo, whom I will just turn to his page here. Nick Szabo, who has often been identified as a potential Satoshi, is publishing on smart contracts and on ideas which actually resemble nothing so much as Ethereum now, among other contemporary blockchain and cryptographic projects. And in particular, Hal Finney, who you saw a picture of earlier, here appears as an active and deeply committed extropian, writing about the project of how to build digital cash systems in order to protect privacy, but also to begin to develop long-term stores of value. And this is the second thread that I would like to come back to about the utopian heritage of Bitcoin, the sort of theological heritage of Bitcoin. which is along with the fantasy of being able to create a form of market exchange which can so amplify the pace of technological innovation that it will create all of these breakthroughs and save its creators from death, they also begin to plan for the possibility that they might die. The solution for the possibility of death is to have themselves cryonically frozen and then resurrected in the society that they predict. So in fact, many of the people that I've talked about so far today who have passed on are actually all in the same place. They're all in Scottsdale, Arizona, where their heads are frozen in these massive aluminum tanks called dewars, waiting for the future in which their brains can be successfully extracted, their consciousness reconstructed, and, not least of all, where they will have access to assets, where they will have access to all of the wealth that they have created that has persisted through time because it is based not in national or territorial currencies, but in cryptocurrencies. So in particular, and this to me is a very kind of poignant way to think about this strange utopian legacy, Hal Finney, who has often been identified as another possible candidate for Nakamoto, who was Nakamoto's correspondent, who helped Nakamoto improve much of the code for the initial version of Bitcoin, who developed and refined a number of Bitcoin wallet projects, who was the recipient of the second Bitcoin transaction. Finney died, unfortunately, quite young, relatively speaking, of lateral sclerosis, of Lou Gehrig's disease. And he and his family actually used much of the money that he had accumulated through storing Bitcoin to pay off many of his medical expenses and ultimately pay for him to be frozen and stored away. So he now exists in a very kind of profound sense, simultaneously in the past and in the present and in the conjectured future, in which the society that he was convinced he would be able to bring about through Bitcoin will finally come into being and will bring him back to be conscious again, and with his consciousness to be able to unlock his access to the blockchain once more. I think in some ways one of the most interesting things for us to think about with Bitcoin as we look at it now, especially as you think about it in theological terms, is the way that it begins and has its roots as an eschatological project, right? As a project of the radical transformation of human life and human society. And then by the time Nakamoto creates it, by the time it ends up being, as we learned earlier tonight, something that embeds within itself the banking crisis, it has become instead apocalyptic. It has become instead a technology about saving value through crisis, about storing access to wealth in a very specifically libertarian fashion through the coming crisis of the world, rather than being a technology for many of the extropians. In the long term, money could go away. All they wanted was digital cash as something that could sustain them into the period of transformation, at which point the idea of wealth becomes meaningless, at which point the idea of scarcity ceases to exist for human beings. It doesn't matter if your money needs to somehow hold some larger store of value if you live in a society in which money no longer serves any kind of functional purpose. But by the time we see Bitcoin itself come into being, by 2008 and 2009, we see a fundamental shift in attitude. We see Bitcoin being treated as something to be hoarded, to be stored, to be kept against the coming revaluation crisis. We see it in a mode that is fundamentally apocalyptic, a revelation of failure, and not transcendental as a promise of eventual success. And I think there's something that's quite interesting and profound to look back through this technology in all the strange ways it has played out now, and to see it as containing at its heart a deeply utopian trace. Thank you very much for your attention.